Hello everyone, we're back. Chris Fonsi and Greg Ruiz talking about API design. So now we've basically finished all the kind of fundamental API design concepts, and we're going to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, versioning and deprecation. This isn't really an API design concept per se, and yet it's really key to giving you the ability to iterate quickly on API designs, to handle change, kind of going back to that whole discussion we had about the definition of done and everything being a draft and iteration and digging the new hole and so on.
Right. Moving the hole.
Right,
exactly.
So this really kind of forms a key aspect of API implementation, if you will, in addition to design. And there are some design concepts here that we'll talk about.
So when we think about versioning, I mean, there's several different approaches, right, that we could use. I mean, in fact, we see that out in the wild. Some people gravitate towards a date time stamp. Others think, oh, well, you know what, why not put it as a V in there. One of the things, like with the Salesforce.com example that we have on screen, is that that V30.0, that one sort of, I don't know, we see a couple of them, Facebook as well, the 2.0. I don't know if I'm a big of a fan of putting a dot in there.
Yeah.
Because I don't know about you, but when I see that dot, I start thinking, how many of them are there? Right?
Yeah. Well, you could potentially go crazy with minor version numbers. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what's your preference?
Well, my personal preference is to just use the /v2 without minor version numbers.
Right.
I think the rationale that I would apply to this is that if you are careful about how you approach the design of your API and you give it a little bit of forethought,
right.
There's really not a particular need for versioning numbers. Or for minor numbers, rather. I think the key thing, though, is that you'll want to structure your versioning in such a way that you only version the API in situations where you've broken backward compatibility in some way.
Right.
So, for example, if I add a new item to my XML schema, right? Let's say that I'm shipping XML documents back and forth,
right.
And that happens to be a required attribute. In that particular case, that's a breaking change, and that might mandate a new schema version, right? But if I'm adding some optional query parameter or something that older clients wouldn't know about, newer clients would discover, older clients might come to use this at some point in the future, but it doesn't really break compatibility, then it's, the question I would ask is, well, why version at all?
Absolutely. Well, now I noticed that you're recommending that V2 up there in the front end of the resource identifiers. What is... we saw some of those examples. They're scattered all over the place out there in the wild.
They are, yeah. And I've seen them in lots of different places as well. I think, it kind of depends on philosophically how you approach your API. Generally speaking, what I've seen is that customers tend to think of their API as being an atomic unit. That is to say that the entire API is considered to be under a single version, right? And so obviously in a case like that, saying /v2 up front seems entirely reasonable. Yeah. But there's other cases where, for whatever reason, you can't do it that way. So, for example, let's say that you've got multiple development teams that are all kind of working independently. They all version their portions of the API independently, and you just can't come to a level of consistency that says that the entire API is a specific version.
Right.
So, in that particular case, maybe using an approach like /orders /v2.
Right.
Where you've actually predicated the version with the word orders to indicate that it's this particular portion of the API.
Exactly.
Maybe that's a way to go. And that's kind of what Salesforce did.
Right.
I mean, they just happen to use the minor version number as well, but they had some additional pieces in their path that allowed them to version that particular portion of the API independently.
Well, so that brings up a good question, probably the most philosophical of all the questions, and that is exactly how many versions. I mean, we're starting to keep versions. We're starting to iterate. Our APIs off the charts. We're getting a lot of developer adoption and usage. Now, how long should I hang on to it? How many versions back?
Well, I think the short answer is it depends. The long answer is that it depends very much on your particular type of organization. So the general rule is that you would maintain current version plus one version back.
Okay.
with the idea being that you don't necessarily want to maintain additional back-end systems. You don't want to have any additional complexity and any intermediate systems that you
Right.
might have between your back-end and your API consumers. So maintaining the one version gives you a place to go. You still support the old version so that legacy applications or legacy clients would continue to operate.
And I guess in terms of a time frame, that's it's sort of a nebulous question, like, how high is the sky? Because I think it's going to depend on each individual API or API provider as to how long you maintain that support. I think somebody that's up and coming that doesn't have a lot of users can afford to version more quickly and maintain versions for less time. But when you're looking at someone like a Facebook or a Salesforce that has millions and millions and millions of users, it becomes a much more challenging discussion when deciding how long we should hang on to an API.
Very much so. This is a pretty significant philosophical point, I think, in versioning and deprecation. Companies that version very rapidly, obviously can't maintain a whole bunch of versions, and so
Right.
they generally have a very short deprecation period, and their expectation is that developers will kind of keep up. Right?
Right.
In some cases, they may potentially keep multiple versions depending on exactly how they do versioning.
Right.
For example, if they, for whatever reason, have chosen to version even if they don't bring backward compatibility, then they may actually maintain multiple versions and give their developers some space to spend the time to actually update their
Right.
API and so on.
Twitter had an interesting thing with that, the way that they sort of held on to things until they forced you.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Very much so. But in other cases, some customers or some API consumers, for example, or API designers, will design a deprecation strategy that lasts for a much longer period of time. And the idea is that they really don't want to force their customers to migrate if they don't have to.
Right.
And so they'll actually throw another version out there, but they'll keep the existing version for a year.
Right.
So that people will move eventually, but they're not necessarily forced to do it on the same schedule that other companies might do, for example.
Well, I think so. I think in summary, what we're really saying is it all depends.
It does.
I think that was the answer.
That's pretty much the answer. I think it's up to you in your particular situation as to how you set your deprecation interval.
Now, we've got our API out there. We're versioning it. It's growing. But I'm sure there's some other common problems that we will have to tackle in terms of our API.
Yeah, there's a certain set of common problems that people run into. We'll talk about a few of those as we get into the next couple of sessions, so stay tuned.